CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Live from London, this is The World Today.
Hello, I'm Jamie Owen. Welcome to the program. The headlines: top Chinese and United States commerce officials meet to try to improve trade links in the troubled relationship between the world's two largest economies. Our other headlines: legal woes man for Donald Trump. The former US president will be formally charged next week at a court in Georgia. Spanish prosecutors open a sexual assault investigation into football chief Luis Rubiales' kiss of a player. We're in Madrid for the latest. And thousands of people forced to flee their homes in the Philippines as Typhoon Saloa brings floods and strong winds, and it's heading to China next. China will continue to seek a fair environment for cooperation with the United States. The words of the Commerce Minister, Wang Wentao, who's been meeting his US counterpart, Gina Raimondo, in Beijing. She arrived in China on Sunday for a 4-day visit, seen as the latest attempt to smooth tensions between the world's two biggest economies. Washington says it's not seeking to decouple, but will continue to prioritize US national security. Well, Jeffrey Schott is a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, currently specializing in international trade policy. Jeffrey, good to see you. Welcome. What are your expectations for this visit?
Well, I think the visit has already been successful in that the leaders are meeting. Dialogue is very important. Face-to-face meetings are really indispensable to avoid misunderstandings. And that's where we have to start in rectifying the bilateral U.S.-China relationship.
There's lots of things clearly that they will not agree on, and presumably there will be very little traction on. But what are the specific sectors that we might see some movement on during these meetings?
I don't think you're going to find an interest in seeking new agreements, but as seeking a better understanding of the policies of both countries. And in that regard, the two sides are setting up a joint government business forum, a kind of information clearinghouse, so that investors, U.S. companies in China, Chinese companies trying to do business with the United States have a better idea of the policies that they have to deal with in getting through regulatory hurdles.
Some might say that this relationship couldn't get any worse. How do you think this visit fits into the broader diplomatic context between the two superpowers?
I think it's stabilizing the boat in very unsettled waters. And so it is a good first start. It can lay the foundation for future meetings between Xi Jinping and President Biden, hopefully at the APEC meetings in San Francisco in November. The two leaders getting together would be very, very important in moving our relationship forward.
The relationship between the United States and China is obviously complex and sometimes fragile. Where is the potential to rebuild the bridges between the two countries?
Well, I think politics in both countries makes it very difficult to have any big new advances in the near term. But the area that is most prime for joint cooperation is in dealing with the problems of climate change. And there, Mr. Kerry has met with his Chinese counterpart. We can do a lot together as two of the largest emitters to make some progress on reversing the dangerous developments we've seen in the climate over the past few years.
Jeffrey, good to talk to you. Thanks very much for your analysis. Jeffrey Schott, Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics.
Thank you.
The Chinese property giant Evergrande is now worth a fraction of its former value as trading resumed in Hong Kong after a 17-month suspension. Shares in the company fell 79.4%. Its market value slashed below $600 million, less than 12% of what it was once worth in 2017. In 2022, the Hong Kong Stock Exchange suspended share dealing in Evergrande after it failed to publish financial results for 2021. The company risked being permanently delisted if trading did not resume within 18 months. Ukraine says it's made significant gains in the counter-offensive in the southeast of the country. Kyiv says its troops have taken back control of the town of Robotyne, south of Zaporizhzhia, where the pushback against Russian troops is continuing. It now says it's broken through the toughest lines of Russian defenses in the south and believes Ukrainian forces are poised to make further advances in the coming weeks. Well, the city of Kherson has suffered extensively since the war in Ukraine began. It was liberated from Russian control last November, but since then, people have faced constant shelling. In June, Kherson was heavily flooded after the destruction of the nearby Kakhovka Dam. Our correspondent Yolo Abdavid has the first of two special reports on a city struggling to survive.
It's swelteringly hot, but Lydia is working hard, ripping out damaged insulation from the roof of her home. Her thoughts are with her son, who's 500 kilometers away, and her husband, fighting for Ukraine on the front line.
Nothing scares me anymore. What scares me is that I have no place to live, that I have a small child and I have no place to live. We are currently renting an apartment in Kyiv.
Floodwater after the Kakhovka Dam was detonated reached almost 3 meters in parts of Kherson. Most of her family's belongings have to be thrown away. 3 doors down, Olena has similar problems. A destroyed home and so much to replace.
In our house, the ceiling fell. The walls, the furniture was destroyed in every room. I mean, nothing was left. The shed collapsed and we made a hole in the garage to try to repair a car, but we didn't finish it and it collapsed.
Removing water from the hundreds of houses is a task that's undertaken by a group of local volunteers. This is floodwater from 2.5 months ago, and this NGO are pumping water from all the houses, the cellars of these houses, and I can't begin to tell you after 2.5 months how foul, how horrible is the smell of this dirty water that's been stagnant under these houses for so long.
I coordinated teams to deal with the damage after the dam was destroyed. We pump water out, help people to remove rubble, cleaning the mud and help them remove anything that's been damaged, like plaster from the walls and the furniture.
About a third of the city was underwater. Between bombing and houses that are uninhabitable, it's almost a ghost city. Lydia is tired but defiant and says she'll build a new house as the rubble from her former home is carried away. Yolo Abdavid, CGTN, Kherson, Ukraine.
Russia says it's destroyed a drone approaching Moscow and another 2 in a region closer to the Ukrainian border. Flights were briefly suspended at 2 airports after the device was intercepted early on Monday. Moscow's mayor says emergency services are on the scene in the district of Lyubetsy, south of the capital. Meanwhile, Russia's defense ministry says 2 other drones were also destroyed over the Bryansk region on Ukraine's border. Donald Trump will appear in court next week in Georgia to be formally charged with conspiring to subvert the result of the 2020 election. He'll also find out shortly when a separate trial will begin on federal charges also relating to his alleged attempts to overturn the presidential vote. It's a decision that could have an impact on the former US president's hopes of winning the Republican nomination for 2024. Our correspondent John Terrett is watching events for us in New York. John, just talk us through what's happening today.
Yes. Well, Jamie, there are many moving parts to this story, so I ask you to bear with me. The first and the latest of them happened only within the last 10 or 11 minutes when news broke that Fani Willis, who is the district attorney in the southern state of Georgia, has announced that President Trump and the 18 other defendants in the case in which they're accused of trying to subvert the election within the state of Georgia must appear on September the 6th in court in Georgia, in Atlanta, in order to be what the Americans call arraigned. So in other words, to be given formal charges and for them to be able to say not guilty. Now, you say, well, didn't that happen last week? Well, the trouble with these cases, and there are 4 of them, is that because they're in different states and different locations, each jurisdiction does things differently. Okay, so in previous cases, then President Trump has turned up on one day, pleaded not guilty and gone away. What happened last week was that he and the others were booked in to the Fulton County Jail. And so now, next week, September the 6th, which I think is what's got to be Tuesday, is it next Tuesday or next week, I think it is, then he will appear again in Georgia before court for formal proceedings. So that is the latest breaking news. The other news stems from Washington, D.C. Now, you know that there are 4 cases against President Trump. There's one in Florida, one in Georgia, which I've just talked about, one in New York, which is to do with his business, and in Washington, D.C., which centers around the events of January the 6th, 2021, and whether or not President Trump was at the head of a plot to overturn the election from November of 2020. Now, sorry, I've gone a bit confused about what I wanted to say next.
While you find your thoughts, John, let me ask you, let me come in and ask you, just for the sake of clarity then, there is a second case in court too.
Yes, there is. Let me get to that in just a second. I'm sorry about this. This is where it gets very confusing. So what's happening in Washington, D.C. right now, this is the case surrounding January the 6th, is that the Trump lawyers are asking that that case be deferred to 2026. So that will be well after next year's presidential election. The prosecutors are calling for that case in Washington, D.C. to go ahead in January 2024, so that's early next year. Now, the Trump people say, look, there are 11 million documents that we've got to go through and other pieces of evidence that if they were stacked from floor to ceiling would be as high as the Washington Monument in Washington, D.C. The prosecutors say that that is a load of rubbish because many of the documents are duplicates. Many of them have been revealed already in the House of Representatives probe that went on at the back end of last year. It will ultimately be up to the judge who was appointed by President Obama to decide when the case goes ahead, and most analysts think that she will plump for the first 4 months of next year, the first quarter, which means the trial for Washington, D.C. in January the 6th will be over before the Republican convention in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, which comes up in July. Okay, now, finally, the third piece of this, and I'll keep it very, very brief for you. Sorry about losing my place there. Hasn't happened before. Won't happen again. Mark Meadows is the chief of staff for President Trump at the back end of his presidency. Meadows is appealing in court in Atlanta today to have his trial moved from state court to federal court because he says he was a federal officer. He wants it to be moved a long way from Atlanta as well, where he says he won't get a fair trial. All of this complicates what the district attorney wants to do in Georgia, which is to trial all 19 defendants together. Now, that's not going to happen because 2 of them are going to get an early trial in this October. That leaves 17. It'll be up to the judge to decide whether the one trial for the other 17 goes ahead, and that always assumes that there aren't more legal maneuvers to try and either move away from state court into federal court or otherwise delay these trials, particularly the one in Atlanta, Georgia, any way they can, using perfectly legal moves. I'm sorry, that's very complicated. There's 3 strands to that story today. 3 strands.
Extraordinary story. John, thank you for that. Our correspondent, John Terrett in New York. You're watching CGTN. Still ahead. Is this the final whistle for Spain's Football Federation president? The urgent meeting to discuss the Women's World Cup final row.
Ever wondered what's the difference between a bear and a bull market? Where are the cash cows? And who are the lame ducks? And what exactly are black swans, grey rhinos, and unicorn companies? Make sense of it all with global business, only on CGTN.
There's a new agenda for a new world, accelerating change in almost every part of our lives. It's shifting the norms of how we work, travel, and connect. How we think, interact, and develop. It's a new reality, a new agenda with me, Juliette Mann.
Events have consequences. Words create impact.
One more offensive in a long line of battles that's been ongoing for more.
Just got to be careful here with some gunshots. Excuse us.
The world today matters for your world tomorrow.
The number of casualties is growing quickly.
Why, this is one of the hardest hit towns in the region.
The world today, every day on CGTN.
Hello, welcome back. A reminder of our top stories. Top Chinese and United States commerce officials are meeting to try to improve trade links in the troubled relationship between the world's two largest economies. Our other headlines: legal woes man for Donald Trump. The former US president will be officially charged next week in Georgia as he awaits a trial date in a separate federal case. Spanish prosecutors have opened a preliminary sex abuse investigation into Football Federation chief Luis Rubiales. It comes as the federation holds an urgent meeting into his now infamous kiss of the World Cup winning player Jenni Hermoso, an incident that's tearing the football community apart and creating ripples right across Spanish society. The government has called for Rubiales' removal. FIFA has suspended him while its investigation takes place. But the federation he currently leads has backed his version of events and even threatened to sue Hermoso. Well, let's talk to our correspondent, Ken Brown in Madrid, trying to make sense of all of this. Ken, so just talk us through what's happening now.
Yes, Jamie, well, the saga continues. Rubiales refuses to step down despite the mounting pressure, and we've seen statements, declarations and developments happening at a furious pace today. As you just mentioned, the latest is that the Spanish National Court prosecutors have opened a preliminary investigation into a potential sexual assault against Jennifer Hermoso by Luis Rubiales for that kiss after the World Cup final. Now, that process will only continue if Hermoso herself continues or decides to press charges. She has 15 days to decide on that. Now, this morning we were waiting for a resolution from TAD, which is Spain's National Sports Council, on a report and recommendations by the government to suspend Luis Rubiales, ultimately removing him from his post. While we were waiting for that, we heard the bizarre news that Rubiales' mother has locked herself in a church in Motril in Granada, in the south of Spain, where the family comes from, saying that she's going on hunger strike, citing the inhuman witch hunt and bloodletting that people are doing to her son. Now, she has called on Jenni Hermoso to stop lying, to stop changing her story, but Rubiales' mother is in the minority here. The vast majority of Spaniards, of public opinion, is against Luis Rubiales. Another bizarre story, the RFEF acting president, Andreu Camps, he's pretty much Rubiales' right-hand man. He sent a letter to UEFA on Friday asking UEFA to put pressure on the Spanish government to stop their, what they call, interventionism. Now, sanctions for that could include Spanish football clubs, the Spanish national team being excluded from UEFA competitions like the Champions League or the Euro qualifiers. So, big news happening here. The meeting of the RFEF. We're currently right outside the headquarters here. We're waiting for the different, the 18 regional presidents to show up, and they have a big choice to make. Are they going to support Rubiales, or are they going to forge a new path forward?
Ken, some say this is Spain's Me Too movement.
Yes, you can definitely say that now. This feels like Spain's Me Too moment. When you look at the case in the United States, for example, the Me Too emerged from the entertainment industry. Here in Spain, it's come from the football industry, which is an integral part of life and culture here in Spain. It's pretty much a way of life. Rubiales has acted in a way that most Spanish people do not tolerate and are against. I think the difference between the Harvey Weinstein case and Luis Rubiales is that we all saw what happened. There can be no denying there was an assault. You can't just grab anyone by the head with both of your hands and kiss them on the lips without their consent. That is... you know, we don't even, it's amazing that we even have to say that. And the fact that Luis Rubiales doesn't see it has turned most of Spanish society and most of the world against him. Just yesterday, we heard Diego Simeone, the coach of Atletico Madrid, talking about how he wanted to lend his voice to the 80 to 90% of Spaniards who feel that Luis Rubiales was completely out of order and that he should be removed. Later on, we heard Xavi Hernandez, the Spanish, he's another World Cup winner. He said he gave his unconditional support to Jenny and the team. So this story rolls on. We'll have more for you in the next hour, Jamie.
Ken, thanks for that. Our correspondent Ken Brown in Madrid. Severe flooding unleashed by Typhoon Solar has forced almost 2,000 people to flee their homes in the Philippines. This is the 7th major storm to hit the country so far this year. Solar has now weakened to a tropical storm and is heading towards China. Our correspondent Gretchen Malalad is in Manila.
Typhoon Solar may have weakened, but it's still packing maximum sustained winds of 155 kilometers per hour near the center with gusts of up to 190 kilometers per hour. It is expected to re-intensify into a super typhoon as it turns northwestward by mid-Tuesday. During its peak over the weekend, Super Typhoon Solar dumped more than 200 millimeters of rain over provinces in northern Luzon, which triggered heavy flooding in dozens of communities. Hundreds of families from the provinces of Cagayan, Ilocos and Isabela have fled their homes due to the flooding. There were reports of roads and bridges in Narvacan town in Ilocos that were damaged. The strong current from the river swept away parts of the road, small bridges, and even a two-story concrete house collapsed into the raging river. Typhoon Solar has also enhanced the southwest monsoon, which triggered heavy rains around the country. Bacolod City, which is in the Visayas region, have reported heavy flooding in 12 towns. Floodwaters went as high as 10 feet and more than 1,000 individuals needed to flee their homes and seek shelter in evacuation centers. Typhoon Solar is expected to exit the country on Thursday morning or afternoon and is headed towards Taiwan Strait before making landfall over southeastern China on Friday evening. Gretchen Malalad, CGTN, Manila.
Scientists say climate change probably accelerated the destructive nature of the deadly wildfires in Hawaii. At least 115 people were killed and many remain unaccounted for following the blaze earlier this month. Officials now say adapting to a warmer planet must be a central part of the rebuilding process. CGTN's correspondent Greg Navarro reports from Maui.
Before the wind-whipped flames raced through Lahaina, scientists say the historic town and much of Maui faced an increased risk for wildfires.
Climate change sets a background condition of dry soils, of drought. We've had expanding drought here in Hawaii. We've had reduced rainfall. The air is warmer. And, the result of all those factors leads to greater chances of ignition.
The winds were a byproduct of a high-pressure system colliding with a nearby hurricane, accelerating the speed of the fire and ultimately increasing the devastation. There's another factor scientists say is at play here across the island, which began 20 years ago. The unintended consequences of a shift in Maui's economy away from agriculture toward a heavier reliance on tourism.
These agriculture fields, these huge plantation fields, have been abandoned and they've been overgrown with invasive weeds that rapidly sprout up if there's any rain. And then in the following drought, they dry out and they form, highly flammable conditions along with the drying that goes with climate change.
Researchers believe these fire-prone grasses now cover nearly a quarter of the state.
So, there's history and economics involved, but in the end, it's a fuels management problem.
Chip Fletcher is the interim dean of the School of Ocean and Earth Science and Technology at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. He says the continued impacts of climate change here need to be considered as part of the rebuilding process.
This is a chance to build what I've referred to as a hyper-resilient community, to pull back from the shoreline, to be aware of the wildfire issue, the heat issue, the hurricane and high winds issue, to build in recognition of these threats using building codes and building materials that will allow us to survive these threats.
Or Fletcher says to better help communities recover once these threats do hit, because they are inevitable. Greg Navarro, CGTN, Maui.
Protests are continuing against the release of treated water from Japan's Fukushima nuclear power station. Tokyo says tests of the water near the facility have not detected any radioactivity since it started being discharged last week. The media was invited to tour the defunct nuclear site on Sunday. Our correspondent Terence Terashima is in Tokyo.
Since the release of contaminated wastewater into the Pacific Ocean, which began last Thursday, there have been several protests across various parts of Japan. Demonstrators reiterated their concerns, saying that the water discharge will cause significant damage to the environment and global food security. The organizers say they will continue to protest until the government stops the wastewater discharge. According to a Mainichi newspaper survey over the weekend, 60% of respondents expressed dissatisfaction with the government and Tokyo Electric Power Company's explanation regarding the release. This marks a 7-point increase from the previous survey in July. Tokyo Electric Company has said that they conducted tests on seawater around the crippled plant, revealing that seawater samples contain less than 10 becquerel of tritium per liter. However, these reports have not allayed many concerns. In response to the discharge, China imposed a complete import ban on all aquatic products from Japan immediately. According to the market research firm Teikoku Data Bank, over 700 Japanese food exporters are affected. Sales of aquatic products to China and Hong Kong accounted for 42% of all Japanese aquatic exports in 2022. Meanwhile, experts from South Korea arrived in Japan on Sunday and visited the field office of the International Atomic Energy Agency, which was opened at the plant last month to monitor the safe discharge of the treated radioactive water into the Pacific Ocean. Length of their stay this time has not been determined yet. This marks the first of the series of bi-weekly visits by South Korean experts to the agency's field office at the plant. Terence Terashima, CGTN, Tokyo.
Well, Japan has summoned the Chinese ambassador after several officers received what it says were harassing phone calls from China over the release of the treated water from the Fukushima nuclear plant. A diplomatic meeting has been postponed over the current strain between the two countries. The head of Japan's Komeito Party, a junior member of the governing coalition, was due to visit China on Monday, but both Tokyo and Beijing agreed to reschedule. And finally, thousands of dogs are putting their best paw forward in Geneva. Breeds from around the world are being paraded during competitions organised over 4 days, showcasing various agility and obedience skills. The annual World Dog Show is a major highlight for dog lovers, with the show drawing hundreds of spectators in person and online. And that is The World Today. Thank you for watching. We're back with more news at the top of the hour. Coming up next, it's World Insight. For now, from all of the team in London, it's goodbye.